Hello everybody and welcome to our Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities data series. This is the second event in the series. Our first event last week was on literacies and this week our event is on civics. I'm Dan Ashton, a fellow in disparate data and unexpected evidence with the Institute, and I'll do a quick intro for the Institute for those who perhaps aren't familiar with it. Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities supports socially engaged, creative and critical research and champions the significance of the arts and humanities in responding to the most pressing crises of contemporary life. The Institute funds pilot and proof of concept research projects, enables and supports a range of focused cross-disciplinary conversations and events, which this is one, and brokers collaborative partnerships, placements and innovative approaches to knowledge exchange. The SIAH data series is intended as an opportunity to engage with different projects on different themes from around the UK. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce the chair and discussant for today, Joanna Nilsson, and then Joanna is going to present our very welcome guests from the University of Edinburgh, Addie McGowan and Liz McFall. Hello both. So where's we go? So Joanna is a poet and researcher completing an SWWDTP, so that's the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership funded PhD at the Universities of Southampton and Bath Spa in association with the writer development agency Artful Scribe. Her debut poetry pamphlet Guerrilla Brightenings was released in March 2020 with Against the Grain Press. Joanna holds an MA in Creative Writing at Bath Spa University, where she worked as Engagement Manager at the Research Centre for Transcultural Creativity and Education. She's also worked as a digital advisor at the University of Glasgow, and most recently on the Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities research project, Scoping the South, Literature Development and the Creative Industries. Joanna's PhD studies entitled Mentoring in the Contemporary UK Poetry Ecology, and the research seeks to discover how poetry is taught to poets using what methods and pedagogies, and how these mentoring practices shape them as poets and practitioners. So following Addie and Liz's presentation, Joanna will engage with her research as part of the discussion and see how it all connects together, and then we will enter into a bigger Q&A. So Joanna, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan, for introducing me, and it's great to be here today. Though I must apologise if I end up being a little bit croaky or stuffy at all. I'm still battling the tail end of a cold. So it's my job now to introduce our two speakers for today. So I'm going to introduce them both and then let them get started with telling us about their exciting work. So we have Dr. Liz McFall, who is Chancellor's Fellow based in Sociology at the Edinburgh Futures Institute within the University of Edinburgh. She writes about how people engage with markets, particularly for technical and complicated propositions like insurance, credit and urban development projects. She has authored and co-edited a range of texts, including most recently Markets and the Arts of Attachment with Frank Cachoy and Joe DeVille from Routledge 2017. We also have with us today Addie McGowan, who is a PhD candidate who holds the Share City Joint Studentship across the Universities of Edinburgh and Glasgow, supervising architecture and sociology. She studies the sharing economy in the city by way of exploring how home sharing platforms like Airbnb co-produce urban place and knowledge via their digital and social infrastructures. So Liz and Addie will be speaking about the digital ethnography project COVID Arcadia, which traces the responses of independent service retailers in Edinburgh to the COVID pandemic, conducted as part of the Data Civics programme at the Edinburgh Futures Institute. COVID Arcadia investigated adaptations to digital premises using ethnographic methods to analyse the role, affordances and interplay of these changes across material and digital premises. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Daniel, and thank you both for the invitation. Addie and I are really pleased to get a chance to talk about this work because it's still fresh and ongoing and kind of unfolding, and most of it's taken place during the context of COVID. So there's been a lot of kind of invention and experimentation involved in how these projects have developed. I'll start sharing my screen, and hopefully it'll work as well this time as it did when we tried it a minute ago. So you can see a blue screen, right?
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, I should actually check. How long do you want us to talk for?
We're not going to be too tight on time, but maybe 25 minutes, half an hour.
Perfect. We should be able to be done in less than that. Okay, so Data Civics is a programme that was set up by me in the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which is a kind of interesting part of Edinburgh University. Edinburgh University, the campus, if you don't know it, and there's no reason why you should, neighbours a very large old hospital, the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, which was vacant since about 2001. It was gradually rotting away. It's a 150-year-old, I think, pavilion-style hospital, a beautiful Scottish baronial building, which carries the heart, soul, and lived memories of many, many people who were born sick, died there. And it was a little bit of a kind of tragedy for Edinburgh that that building had just been let to decay. The university had a chance to buy it about 7 or 8 years ago, and it took it, and it has been redeveloped as the Edinburgh Futures Institute, and it is expected to formally open its doors next year. The Edinburgh Futures Institute has been charged with the idea, with the job of opening up University of Edinburgh. Now, I don't know what the look and feel of Southampton is, but Edinburgh University has a peculiar relationship with the city in the sense that it's the biggest landowner and the biggest employer, but the city doesn't really regard the university as its own. It is not quite ivory tower, but it is behind closed walls. The job of the Futures Institute is to open that up, to become a more porous institute that is open to the public. The hospital had the words Patet Omnibus inscribed above the entrance, open to all. And the Futures Institute job is to be open in that way, to kind of have a more fluid relationship with the communities, business, government, what are they called? Third sector organisations that surround it, to have that outward facing engagement with the city. And that is a big part of what Data Civics is expected to deliver, to make this building more accessible to the city, so that the university becomes a little bit more city facing. Data Civics takes that quite literally in developing a programme of work around seeing and engaging with the city. So I'm not expecting you to read everything on that slide, but I'll talk to a few of the ideas that are on it. This slide's actually a screenshot from our brand new website, which isn't properly live yet, but has been ridiculously cumbersome to try and make happen due to the fact that the Edinburgh Futures Institute has been compared to setting up a university the size of St Andrews in a very short time, with a very small staff and a budget that's never large enough. So getting a functional website has been one of the bugbears for all the staff who are associated with EFI, but we are getting closer. So we started from this basis of trying to kind of open up the university. I am from not quite Edinburgh, but just outside, and Edinburgh University wasn't perceived as somewhere that was necessarily for local people. Its student population is local. People who live near the university are not well represented amongst the student population. So trying to understand that and trying to understand how the university engages with the city is a big part of the motivation. So we started with the idea that we had to think about how you map and plan urban and particularly civic space. And this conceit that the platform on which you stand gives you a perspective on people and the city, allows you to see different things and see things differently. Edinburgh has a particular relationship with the development of photography and the development of mapping. It's a very, very hilly city. So a number of the earliest maps and plans and views of the city were obviously taken from people mounting some of the different hills that the city is built around. And those hills and perspectives give you a different sense. As with all mapping, what you see depends on where you stand. Now, in the top right corner, there are two views of the camera obscura. The camera obscura, if you know Edinburgh, sits just beneath Edinburgh Castle. Patrick Geddes, who is the sociologist who's driven most of the ideas behind the way we are articulating and expressing what Data Civics' job is, actually bought the Outlook Tower, what he renamed the Outlook Tower, but had been functioning as a camera obscura at the top of the Royal Mile in Edinburgh for a number of years in the 19th century before he bought it. And he bought the Outlook Tower with the aim of establishing a sociological observatory and laboratory. So he was quite committed to this idea that civics involved ongoing close observation of the city and all its various elements, and also experimentation. And we're taking this idea quite literally, that a lot of the work that we're trying to build in the programme is about observation, sometimes about using massive passive observational data, other times about using different and novel forms of photography, and other times about collecting visual evidence from the various platforms that we'll talk about. So the approach is about researching cities in the regional and national context, and it's grounded in a recognition that places are hybrid, technical, material, historical, bureaucratic, and sentimental in character. So we interpret civics as an assembled set of observational and experimental methods, following Geddes's play with the notion of the camera obscura. We're looking at civics as in the way that it can use a physical apparatus, but also become a conceptual mechanism. And this idea of the camera obscura is ripe for reimagination in a contemporary context. And I hope that that will become clear in the projects that we're going to talk about. That understanding how you see a city is about understanding and playing with sometimes quite visual experimental methods. So formally, the aim of civics is to use new and established forms of data, platforms, and innovation, specifically to gather, amplify, orchestrate, and engage the diversity of civic voices, particularly those civic voices that the university hasn't traditionally been very good at engaging with. And a big part of this is finding ways to recognise and engage expertise that is outside the university. Recognise the expertise of people whose voices are not usually heard in, for example, formal consultation exercises. So we're going to talk about 3 different projects, 2 of which I'm really only going to briefly mention, and 1 in a bit more detail that Addie will talk more about in a bit. So 2 of the projects are COVID Arcadia, which is the one we're going to spend some time on, which was a Scottish Funding Council supported project which looked at the way independent retailers were combining material changes and digital tweaks to their digital platforms to try and endure and trade during COVID. We focused particularly on traders in the hospitality sector when they weren't allowed to let people in. So how do they sustain a business, sustain a market, sustain an atmosphere when the shop has to be closed? The other project is Civic Scope. Now, Civic Scope was a project based on understanding the architectural and planning imprint of a part of Edinburgh along the North Shore, which is Granton, an area which has been the subject of numerous regeneration plans, numerous attempts to preserve something of its very distinctive mixed coastal, industrial, architectural, and cultural heritage, but nevertheless continues to rank in the most deprived segment of the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, despite these successive attempts. Civic Scope was designed by myself with the photographer Simon Phipps, who's a quite well-known photographer of brutalist architecture, post-war brutalist architecture, which there is a lot of in Granton and neighbouring areas, and Darren Umney, who's someone who collaborated with and worked quite closely with on a number of different projects. It was supposed to involve both of them combining research into the attempts to plan and regenerate Granton over time with real-life photography. And it was funded before the pandemic outbreak. And in the end, both Darren and Simon are based in the southeast, so weren't able to come to Edinburgh. So the question that arose was, how do you see a city when you're not physically there? And the output from that, the outcome of that, was Civic Scope, which presents a panoramic exhibition of the Granton waterfront development area in this kind of strange bi-directional digital leporello, which unfolds and allows you to kind of take this zoom out and zoom in, see things from very far away and then zoom right in. So from a panorama from Google Earth all the way into an internal architect's drawings of a room layout, combined with community views of the area. There's a very active filmmaking organisation based in Civic Scope that based in Granton, that Irvin Welsh is the patron of, called Screen Edinburgh. And Screen Edinburgh builds on a long series of community video in the area, Pilton Community Video being one of the key predecessors. So there's a lot of film archive going back to the 60s and 70s, documenting how the community viewed the area. Like a lot of areas that are subjects of regeneration and that have the characteristic of a continual reproduction of similar patterns of spatial inequality, it has a very active community voice. The question is whether those community voices are properly heard and represented in planning. So on this slide, you get a sense of some of the different kinds of visual sources that are brought together in Civic Scope, from old photography sources to community photography and community film, to future planning documents, and to contemporary photography. The Civic Scope project gave us a background for, I'm going to move back and forward between time here. It gave us an insight. We learned a lot about Granton in the process of doing the Civic Scope work. But around about the same time and overlapping, we began to look at Granton from a different kind of platform, which ultimately turned into this project, which is a local acceleration funded ESRC project, which is engaging with Granton from the perspective of how questions of representation and public engagement work. I won't talk much about it, because I hope what will become clear as we move on to the next section is that this actually built on some of the methods that we used in the COVID Arcadia project, which we'll talk about most, which involved this kind of attempt to see, witness the city using only platforms, notably Instagram. But in this particular, in this project on the Granton Regeneration, we're not just looking at Instagram, we're looking at the digital presence of on all sorts of platforms, of all sorts of different businesses and community organisations and industrial organisations in the area, and auditing how they use those platforms, what are the kind of exemplars of good practice and what are the surprises, what are the gaps. And that is combined with this kind of accidental set of methods, including walking methods, where the researchers, who are not from the area for the most part, don't know it particularly well, but now we're allowed out in real life. The team do some walking methods, walking around and comparing this digital footprint with an in real life footprint and moving back and forward between them. So on the COVID Arcadia project, so this began, I think in summer 2020, after the researchers who worked on it, which is myself and Addie, but also Idil Gallup, Elif Bousdouyerin, and Kath Bassett, who are not here today. I think we had separately and independently, just like everyone else, been tracking and watching the city and looking at how these sudden transformations were taking place, about how you could physically move, where you could physically stand, how you could do very basic things, what was polite, what was social, what was civic conduct in public space, and how were the adjustments and improvisations being made to explain to people where they could physically put themselves. It became a Scottish Funding Council project as we focus more and more on what, as people would, Addie can explain this better than me, but as people were sitting at home at the most restricted part of lockdown, what people were often doing was witnessing their cities from the perspective of Instagram in particular, just scrolling through, getting a sense of of how the city was changing, and then in real life walking around the city and seeing things that they wouldn't normally have encountered, becoming tourists in their own city. So the way that people used the city, the places they went, the places they visited, and the kind of patronage that retailers received started to change in companion with changes in digital platforms. And this kind of struck me as being very reminiscent, the methods that were emerging, being very reminiscent of the type of rag picker method that Walter Benjamin featured in the Arcades project. One of the other things that I had taken from Benjamin, going way back in terms of having a long interest in promotion and advertising and how you persuade people to physically move their bodies and follow the line of least resistance so that the transaction and the encounter in market space actually completes. And Benjamin talks about prompt language. He talks about advertising as being the most effective form of political speech. And we played around with this idea in the sense of this prompt language that moves you around a space and how that is visible in all sorts of rags and detritus in public space. So the arcade for Benjamin was the most important architectural form of the 19th century. And the Arcades project in German is Passagenwerk, or the work of the passage, the work of the arcade. And I really like this idea that this kind of very, very mundane space conditions movement, conditions behaviour in a very active way that we don't often attend to. What made it visible during COVID was the fact that it broke down and the rules changed overnight. We were not normally aware of the fact that our behaviour, we are conducted through public space. The photograph on this slide struck us as being this remarkable photograph that even a few months earlier would have made no sense what was happening in that. But it features, obviously, masks, but by then, this is 6 months in, this bespoke serving hatch, safe servers, I believe they're called, which a small shop fitter in Edinburgh, which is associated with higher end type retailers, independent retailers, hospitality in particular, by the end of 2020 had specialised in making these safe servers, which were adapted and branded. And if you can see down there, there's also a hashtag and a direction back to Splinter, which is the company that makes the safe servers. So that there's that piece of furniture is arranging behaviour and preventing people from coming into the shop and shaping how they transact safely with this pastry section shop, which is in Stockbridge and does incredibly good bakery. So these kind of material adaptations that take place in real life also have their digital footprint, and there's this movement back and forward. So what could have looked like a barrier, a block, which in the early days of the pandemic often did, when you saw these improvised use of traffic cones and tables and desks and other blocks to prevent people moving where the regulations prevented them doing so, became by the end of the year these much more polished solutions, which were then became part of an atmosphere or an aura even on Instagram. So how this kind of aura and this language about this atmosphere of the shop is created back and forward in digital and material space was a central part of the project. And I'm now going to pass to Addie to explain that.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Liz. So as we were observing what Liz was just talking about, the adaptations of businesses in Edinburgh, our research team of 5 worked with students to actually pay them per photograph that they took through the funding of the project to capture these material responses around the city. We, of course, did some photographing as well, and then we eventually ended up working with bike delivery riders as well to take photographs of what they're seeing. So we essentially had this infused group of probably around 40 photographers and observers throughout the city, again, to kind of nod to Patrick Geddes on the kind of laboratory and observatory. So we were mobilized that way offline. We realized that all the retail outlets we observed really did have to make a variety of material and also technical adjustments to their premises in order to continue trading safely, as Liz said, and comply with the rapidly changing restrictions and regulations associated with the pandemic. So it was not only fear, safety, but it was also legal requirements as well. So like I said, we documented and engaged with these changes in real time, capturing those businesses' responses. You can see things here on this slide like signs, bespoke hatches, as Liz just talked about, plexiglass screens, lanes, traffic lights, sanitizer dispensers, etc. So for service outlets like cafes and coffee shops and hairdressers who offer an experience of atmosphere, the pandemic conditions presented, of course, a particular challenge there. So one of the things that I really wanted to touch on today in terms of how we did all of this is one significant thread that we've identified as a constant throughout our project, and the other project that Liz mentioned with the Granton Hub is Instagram's multitude of roles in these responses, including our own. So Instagram, of course, we are limited by the usership. Most of the users on Instagram are between 25 and 54 years old. The largest group of those users are 24 to 34 years old. So I fall in that majority user age group. So I wanted to make us all aware of that. But for me and my peers and a lot of the people working on this project, and indeed a lot of the businesses, Instagram was a really important space and place for Edinburgh's response to COVID. Next slide, Liz.
Oh yeah, that's my job, isn't it?
Thank you. So we ended up using Instagram as our main project tool for data collection, analysis, engagement, and amplification. So again, going back to Patrick Geddes, it's both a lab and an observatory space. So it's a way to observe, and it's a way to play and interact with and experiment with the data that we were collecting. So we created a project Instagram account to collect these data, engage with them, and amplify local businesses all in the same tactic, I guess, for our research. So we quickly realized that the account's newsfeed ended up becoming its own entry point into a carefully curated sort of arcade through the city itself. What we did as the account is we began following local businesses that we knew of. We patroned the businesses that the group of 40 or so photographers around the city were capturing and interacting with. And we began to follow them and interact with them all day, every day throughout the course of the project. So then as we were logged into that account on Instagram, the news feed of that account became that digital arcade. So we were able to create this curated pathway through the city of in a way that really helped us continue to observe what was going on. We curated our own news feed, so to speak. So it was a place that we could almost become digital flaneurs, watching while being visible as well, liking and interacting with these posts, navigating Edinburgh and getting to know the city and its networks of businesses from a socially distanced vantage point, which was key during that phase in the pandemic. So we were able to also then not only see what businesses were posting, but to see the networks and intricacies of the way that they share ideas and relate to each other. So we would see which businesses were following each other. We noticed a culture of support and not competition during the pandemic, of course. We shared businesses' posts as our own through our own account, interacted with them, and used the account to, like I said, concurrently collect and analyze data in real time and really think with that data in a public way. Next slide, Liz. So I won't get too much into the weeds here, but on Instagram, we did see some really interesting things that I think we've all probably realized in our own cities and places. But we saw businesses shift their energy to their digital premises, because for a lot of these businesses, especially in the UK, it was the only place they could really interact with customers and the general community. So a lot of their accounts became much more active than they were before COVID. The savviest of these businesses understood Instagram as an extended digital reconfiguration of their physical locations, and they used the platform to connect with a captive audience of their customers and networks to manage their business. So, unsurprisingly, and I'm sure you all have experienced this, many use the platform as their main channel for announcements about closures, pivots, safety protocols, but our findings extend well beyond communication about those things and into the affective, kind of labor that the business owners put forth into the ether to continue connecting with the community. So I know Liz also mentioned in Civic Scopes that the photographers were no longer in Edinburgh. As you can tell, I'm from the United States. So during COVID, I went back to the US to spend lockdown with my partner who lives there. And so I was actually doing this work from afar. It really I felt connected to Edinburgh doing this work, and it was a really interesting thing to then think with the data outside of that market as well. Next slide, Liz. So what we also did was that we leveraged our Instagram findings kind of in this next phase as we were building relationships with these businesses and kind of in an Instagram ethnography. We leveraged that as prompts and interviews with these businesses to dig deeper into their social experiences and backstage management of these adaptations. So it was an interview elicitation tool. I won't get into this in the interest of time. You can ask about it in questions if you'd like. But for example, the little chart room is a restaurant in Edinburgh, and during the pandemic they pivoted to this kind of stall, a food stall on the Portobello Beach Promenade. And so we were able to follow that transition and that adaptation. It was a really fascinating thing to watch. And then we interviewed the chef, and he discussed the different roles he was required to play during COVID, from an improvisational architect of the proms food stall, which you see here, to a health and safety manager. I mean, he said that the only communication from the government that they got was when the news broke that something new had to happen. So there was no communication about regulations. So they just had to manage that, and he had to use his own judgment for health and safety in his food service space. He was also the social media marketer who started and runs the Concepts Instagram account, which was separate from the main restaurants one, posting menus for each week. And he also was a steward of the brand. So COVID required a lot of these small business owners to create affective moods and spaces on their digital premises as well. So he ended up actually doing a lot on Spotify, which is a different platform I'm sure you are all familiar with to listen to music that is social and collaborative. So he made Spotify playlists each week to entertain outdoor diners as they would come and take away food. You know, they also paired playlists with their at-home, finish-at-home meals too, to really get the mood and the atmosphere of the premise in your own home. So in this and other examples, we found that digital affective labor found on Instagram and other platforms like Spotify generated audience engagement and participation in a way that enabled these businesses to expand through community connection and brand experience through an otherwise extremely precarious time for small and independent businesses. You can see here the little chart room, just yet another example, expanded during COVID. And then, you know, as things have opened back up, they've taken this concept into a more brick and mortar restaurant, and it's thriving as well. So again, you know, that's just a little example of some of the work that we did on Instagram as a living lab, a living observatory, and a COVID arcade itself in the newsfeed, and some of the businesses that we looked at. And back to you, Liz.
Okay. Thanks, Addie.
Thanks.
So this is the last slide, but just to follow up on some of the points Addie's just been making. So what happened in the COVID Arcadia project, and in fact in all three of the projects that I've mentioned, is this moving back and forward between digital methods and more traditional methods, but in quite experimental ways of sandwiching them both together, where there's this kind of constant iteration between what we're seeing digitally and what we're able to observe in more traditional ethnographic methods. And all of this is geared towards trying to understand urban and civic space in terms of how technical methods orchestrate with affect or sentiment in terms of changing the way people look, or intervening or witnessing the way people feel about and experience place. This last film that I'm going to end with is part of Civic Scope, and it was made by Simon Phipps and Darren Umney using Google Earth and Google Studio to witness one of the key architectural sites in Granton, but from an entirely digital perspective. And for me, it's strangely moving, but you can tell me whether that's just because I happen to have a strong affection for this particular piece of architecture afterwards. Thank you.
Investment Sales Centrica plc, Scottish Gas Headquarters, 1 Waterfront Avenue, Edinburgh, EH5 1SJ. Investment Summary. Landmark Office Investment, fully occupied by British Gas, is their operational headquarters in Scotland. Award-winning Foster and Partners design Grade A office extending to 91,784 square feet. High-quality specification and environmental credentials, having achieved BREEAM Excellent certification. Located in Edinburgh, Scotland's capital city and one of the UK's Big 6 regional office markets. Fully let to GB Gas Holdings Limited, 501 Dun and Bradstreet. Rating: on a full repairing and insuring lease expiring the 14th of September 2020. Guaranteed by Centrica plc, a member of the FTSE 100 index with a market capitalisation of £11.25 billion. Current passing rent of £1,658,268 per annum, £18.16 per square foot, with 5-yearly upward only rent reviews. Absolute ownership, Scottish equivalent of English freehold. Offers in excess of £16,875,000, subject to contract and exclusive of VAT, are invited for the absolute ownership in the property. Cushman and Wakefield Sales Brochure 2015.
That's it.
Well, thank you both for such a fantastic session. I think it, for me, definitely brings back a real sense of the sheer creativity and ingenuity and that kind of rapid transition that everyone had to go through at the start of the pandemic, whether you're working in business or even in your own team with the different research methodologies that you just have to come up with to figure out how on earth you're going to observe these things once you can't access them physically. I was just going to touch on a couple of things that I thought, and then I was going to move on a little bit to more some of my own research to kind of bridge that gap between how some of my work relates to yours. But I thought your approach in respecting the amount of expertise that comes from outside of universities was really spot on. I mean, especially with this work, because you're working with the communities, it makes a lot of sense that they are the ones with the expertise, and to recognise that I think is very important. And I also really liked your description of civics as this hybrid, material, historical, bureaucratic and sentimental thing that's this many-limbed creature. And I think that interdisciplinary approach is really important to understanding a place and a people and why certain phenomena and inequalities have come to exist, and by examining kind of all its facets. And I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit. Either of you.
You want to start, Liz? No.
Could you say the last bit again, Joanna?
Sure. I said I thought it was very important to come with that kind of interdisciplinary approach and acknowledging that civics happens on those like many layers to really understand why certain phenomena and inequalities have happened and come to exist.
Yeah, I think that's key for us. I mean, we're all sociologists, but I think we nearly all have kind of interdisciplinary backgrounds, and certainly an interdisciplinary field of interest. Edinburgh Futures Institute is explicitly radically interdisciplinary in its approach. But in terms of trying to kind of think differently about how academic research works as a form of expertise and how it can interact with places and cities and the community's expertise, I think that involves a degree of openness, which is not typical of a very strict adherence to methods. I also think that in the digital and platform-based context even, no one's really figured out yet how to use digital tools and methods in a way that's meaningful. So if you think about, we use Twitter and Instagram in particular as data sources, and as Addie can explain better than me, in all sorts of other ways. But if you think back to that first enthusiasm for Twitter visualization, where you got these elaborate and quite beautiful sometimes depictions of visualizations of who's talking to who and who's where the clusters are and where the hashtags are, that ultimately don't tell you very much. We want to kind of use this in that, it's not my phrase, it's someone else's, massive passive observational data that is rich with meaning and rich with insight into lived experience, how people are talking, how they're expressing themselves. So that's, yeah, you're spot on. These things are really important for us.
Yeah, and I'll add that we do acknowledge how middle class and white all of these businesses are that we were following. And so working with Instagram kind of brings light what is not represented, who is not represented. And I think that's just an important realization that we wouldn't have necessarily had if we were scraping data, for example, or working outside of the platform. We recognize this very elite network of business owners, independent business owners in Edinburgh, that is very homogenous and very well funded and very well, supported by other by their patrons who look like them too. So I think, long story short, that this this also sparked a lot of conversations of who is not visible in these platforms, who is not as resilient during COVID. And we're feeding that into our next project right now with Granton, where we're doing a wide-scale digital audit. So not starting from the platform, but starting from Google Maps, seeing who has a listing, and then putting that in conversation with walking through the streets, taking photos of what businesses are not even listed, and then kind of learning that knowledge exchange is important in that from project to project and type of resilience to non-resilience.
I think that's really interesting with that particular methodology and approach to mapping, because as I'll speak to it in a little bit, but mapping is something that not as much in my PhD project now, but in my previous work history at various universities, I've done mapping projects, and particularly actually my most recent one with SIAH. And I've kind of used that similar sort of approach, going through it from a very community kind of an aspect, because you have this the most the most affluent and successful businesses obviously are the ones who are able to pay for kind of those premium positions on online platforms. So kind of going at it with that approach of the on the ground, I really like that. I think that will be really fruitful. So I think I'll mention a little bit more about some of my own work, and we can maybe discuss a small bit of that, but then we can move on to the Q&A, because I'm aware we don't have a huge amount of time left. So to talk a little bit about my research, that has been primarily in creative writing, but I kind of use that a little bit loosely because it is very, like yours, inherently interdisciplinary, and it's been I've been working with projects at the University of Glasgow, which I mentioned to you, Addie, briefly, Southampton and Bath Spa. And that's been examining writers, but not so much their writing, but looking at them really as human beings who are kind of embedded in a real landscape. So looking at things like infrastructures for writing, like the funding available to writers, and both in a material sense and a digital one, what is really out there for writers, how does it affect them? And that's kind of inherently interdisciplinary, but also kind of intersectionally feminist. It's looking at how these phenomena have all come together to make things unequal and inaccessible for certain people to access writing as a craft. So, for example, one of the projects that I was involved with was one of the first major Zoom literary festivals, which was designed very much as a bit of a disruptor to the normal traditional model of a literary festival, because it was a Zoom festival, it was free. They literally sent the link out on Twitter, and it was designed for a lot of people who would never feel comfortable going to a literary festival. They're not going to go to Hay Festival because they feel excluded, that it's very elite, that it's very unwelcoming. And this was one of those places where this project opened up a digital new space, and it was a time when I think it was still the end of March, actually, 2020. So no one really knew how to use Zoom either. We certainly didn't. We were getting used to it when we were running the sessions. But it was this very democratic way because of that, because we hadn't actually even developed the webinar format. It was all just one big meeting. Everyone's cameras were still on because it was all very new. And it was this wonderful, lovely kind of coming together of writers everywhere. And then there's been some other projects, which actually I won't go into as much detail as I thought I was going to, but I've been working more place-based projects, which have been looking at how to organise local governments and like libraries and all layers of the community to come together to build festivals for writing that are really embedded kind of more in the landscape and the cultures of a particular town. So I wondered if I could kick us off with a question that kind of speaks to some of that experience, which because I've been working with some physical, some digital literary spaces, I'm interested in these digital spaces and how they're being maintained past that initial lockdown phase of the pandemic, and especially for disabled and otherwise shielding communities. I should say for context that my debut pamphlet was about the experience of being a shielder during the pandemic. So for me, it was interesting to hear you talk about this, the Arcadia project particularly, because for me, that was the only way that I experienced my home city of Brighton for a good year. I wasn't allowed to go into the city centre, so those projects were completely vital for me. So I was interested if either or both of you could speak a little bit to the kinds of digital spaces that you think offer something going forward that you think are still going to be useful going forward.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and Addie might have more to say on this too, because the COVID Arcadia Instagram account we've been talking about, it became this very lively thing, and we learned a lot, and we were interested in what would stick. I mean, endurance and recovery were a big part of the motivation. But in the end, we've let the Instagram account go quiet, but that's not what I think. What we're playing with is trying to refigure out what we learned from that as a method. So kind of observing. I think our informed hypothesis would be that a number of businesses got very, very good at cultivating an atmosphere on Instagram. But as I think Addie was saying a few minutes ago, this was not typical across the board. I mean, there are plenty of other businesses where they either judge or don't consider it core mission to develop that kind of presence, and they may be right, because it's the ones that have an Instagram audience that become very good at their Instagram footprint. But I think it's been absolutely crucial in terms of us trying to figure out, well, how could we play with these methods and develop them, and that has to be iterative. So I think we know this. The world has changed, and the way people engage with their local spaces has changed permanently. Part of North Edinburgh I live in has changed permanently as a result of the fact that people moved to different parts of the city, partly occasioned by them seeing attractive pictures on Instagram. I mean, they moved around and visited different parts of the city. The Portobello, the seasidey bit of Edinburgh that Addie mentioned earlier, was kind of a bit down at heel, and it's really become this kind of Brighton-like, exciting, hip space. I mean, it was kind of going that way, but it's really accelerated through the pandemic.
Yeah, I think the two responses, I mean, Liz touched on our own Instagram presence, and, you know, as we're moving into this other project, the Granton Project, there was discussion around, do we turn Covert Arcadia into the new Instagram for this project? And I argued very strongly to not, because I think it's important to keep now that the data set has changed even further to be an archive. And I think it's very important to preserve that archive so that we can look back and see a very clean, kind of bounded moment in time that endures all, you know, for at least the near future, so people can go and revisit it. We can still log in and interact, and now that project can interact with other projects, things like that. As far as I think your question about how have businesses continued to be resilient and changed again, I think that there are a lot of material changes that have remained, even QR codes on tables rather than menus, for example, you know, things like that, and just sort of a general, I think, awareness of like the safety, comfortability of guests in spaces. Yeah, so I can't speak fully to, you know, I don't have much of I haven't done systematic research on that, but yeah.
No, thank you. No, I think it's a good point that I think the pandemic asked people to really consider their users in a completely different way, and really, it was a very I'm trying to think of the technical word for it. I'm sure there's a better word, but really put themselves in their shoes in terms of how they would feel and the kind of emotional and physical context of their experience of their businesses.
Sure. Even again, the chef that I interviewed, he's actually a friend of mine too, and he mentioned, you know, even asking guests to wear masks, and they may have a non-visible reason why they can't wear a mask. So even then, being aware of invisible disabilities of guests who are in is something that he now, you know, and then he since then took an active role in shaping his space for the brick and mortar restaurant that they now have. So, and just sort of bringing that ethos and that understanding and new, maybe empathy would be the word that you were thinking of, kind of into that. It is something that endures through the next phase.
So I think we have time for a few questions. If anybody in the audience, I can see we have some people typing furiously. I wonder, Dan, actually, did you have any questions?
Oh, Michael, we can go with Michael because he just typed your. That's a quick. Thank you. That's such a fascinating presentation. Oh, Michael's come on now. Okay.
Sorry, I was writing an essay and then I wrote 3 questions. It's really fascinating presentations and project, and response as well. So I've just put one here, but I've got loads of questions. I was really interested in what you were saying about atmospheres and this kind of curation of cool atmospheres, and how does that sort of, do you have a critical framework for addressing those atmospheres? Because it's like, strikes me it could be slightly problematic in the real world. And how do that sort of curation of coolness or cool atmospheres relate to other aspects of the civic, like political culture, for instance? Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Oh, that's a great question, which I could talk for about 15 minutes on. So I'll probably try to avoid that. I think one of the instincts that we had, and I would stand by that, and to kind of park the politics for a bit, one of the things that becomes apparent or became apparent to us is just how skilled these quite small business owners or pub tenants or what were at using Instagram to communicate and to listen to and respond to and have relationships in this conversational way with their clientele. And I think that this is kind of this echoes for me a broader point about something that a market that's functioning, and I'm using that in a very general sense to mean these kind of retailing transactions, has lessons for civic organisations in terms of how they recognise and engage with their publics, and governmental organisations also. City of Edinburgh Council, who we're working with on the Granton Project, know that they're parts of the community that they don't reach and don't talk to. They know, but they haven't figured out what these mechanisms are. I think there's an interplay back and forth, there's a learning, and one of the things that we are trying to do is kind of create the sort of bridge between what actors in different sectors do and what they're good at and what they're less good at. And that's not a political matter as much for us. I think it's more of a kind of methodological or technical thing of trying to kind of say, well, look at these affordances over there and why that works for that group of actors. And maybe there's something you could use, maybe not. Maybe this is just not relevant for you, but maybe they have techniques of being engaged that governmental actors often don't, local government often don't. They don't resource or prioritise this kind of active ongoing conversation, this sense of atmosphere or crack with their publics.
Yeah, and I think to quickly build on that, you know, I mentioned this, but the COVID Arcadia project and now this Granton project, I think, really work well to as inverts of each other. You know, looking at, again, these very well established local businesses that arguably have gentrified certain areas, and then looking at Granton in the context of, is it regeneration? Is it generation? Let's avoid this. You know, we don't want to reproduce that. We don't want to suggest that should be reproduced, you know, what we saw in COVID Arcadia there. But we did know, you know, so it's a really interesting question. Thank you. And I think doing this work, using kind of similar methods in different contexts is really bringing a lot of that to the surface in ways that I hope will be really useful as we continue to theorize this and work through the implications. It's a non-answer answer.
No, thank you. It's really interesting. I think it raises lots of issues of like responsible atmospheres. If you're going to curate in that sort of way, like particularly in local governments, how is it done ethically, responsibly? You can't just map onto that kind of transactional framework from commercial, the way that it's done commercially.
Right.
Yeah, there's that adaptation, and that's something that we're directly trying to kind of figure out. It's not a case of saying, well, this is how they do it, this is how this use case, this exemplar of good practice is what you should do. We're trying to kind of understand the differences between different actors and different sectors, and figure out, well, what's transferable, and how can we help that translation take place.
Yeah, it's a fascinating project.
Well, thank you for your questions, Michael. I think, are we out of time now, Dan?
We might be, but I'm going to squeeze one in if that's okay. And it's an attempt to connect up the wonderful presentation and hearing about the Data Civics projects and your discussion as well, Jonas. Thank you very much. You started with the university's relationship to place and part of the wider mission of the Institute. And I was fascinated by the university's relationship to place in the context of regeneration, perhaps as part of it now in taking on the ownership of buildings and developing them, and also how that might connect with research and teaching. And then there's something that Joanna said about working with communities and meaningful in-depth engagement. So I was wondering to what extent you'd say the projects that you talked about have been successful, for want of a better word, in opening up the university and that kind of initial mission that you started out with.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think one of the things that was really surprising during the COVID, the first lockdown through 2020 was the extent to which, when we did try to talk to retailers, for example, they were just like, oh God, not more researchers from the university. In a way, the difficulty was us finding their ear. So it wasn't that they were desperate to be heard by us. It was much more that I think the learning was going in the other direction, that we were kind of seeing expertise there that we were trying to catch up with. It's like, if you're an academic trying to build a social media following, if you looked at the ratios with Instagram following and Twitter following and some of these small businesses, they are just adept in a way that the academic isn't, which I think I've kind of lost. I've strayed off topic somewhat, but it's that sense of the relationship isn't what you think it is going to be. It isn't a case of, oh, well, we know this stuff, we understand this stuff deeply, and we can now intervene and change that relationship. In a very kind of anecdotal and tiny scaled way, I think some of the people that we've talked to, and this is becoming clearer in the Granton Project, that if we have conversations on Twitter with people, and they could be just people who live in Muirhouse and which is a neighbouring area to Granton, and have feelings about it that they want to express on Twitter. If we then follow up in face-to-face and walking meetings and in conversations with the whatever, the local baker or whatever, then relationships develop. But this kind of, we can't just kind of turn up at a meeting, talk to them for a bit and then go away. There has to be this kind of multiple attempt over time. And I'm sure you experienced this if you've done any placemaking research anywhere. The last thing that communities want is a researcher parachuting in for the length of duration of a project and then disappearing. So that is a challenge, because our funding cycles and our incentive structures they're not the same as embedding you in an area for 20 years. So it's ongoing to try and figure out, well, how can we be useful?
I think Joanna put it very well, or kind of acknowledged that, the project, one of the aims of the project was to take funds outside of the university. So paying photographers, paying delivery writers, and actively seeking out their perspectives. We also learned some of the darker sides of everything too. Like, for example, in talking to the delivery writers, there's no place to use the toilet at all in their 12-hour shifts. They're constantly exposing themselves, things like that, like to COVID as they deliver. Things like that is just were findings that we wouldn't have found unless we engaged in partnerships with the community rather than looking at the community like participants, if that makes sense. So really co-researchers in that.
I think that comes through so strongly, which made me wonder a little bit about the term observatory. I think there's a history to it, which you elaborated on really well, and there's a reason for working with that term and also reconceptualizing it. But I see that you've stuck with the word observatory, but that suggests kind of a watching present, which from your discussion, your points then, Addie, definitely isn't there. So I was wondering whether you had any tensions or questions around sticking with the word observatory.
I think it's a really interesting one, because I keep trying to say observatory and laboratory, but both of them have quite difficult connotations. But there is something about passive watching that I think can be respectful of communities and of their time, that it's our responsibility to learn and witness, and not just to say, well, come and tell us, come and explain to us, come and tell us about your place. It's like, it's trying to go to where people are at, if that makes sense, to meet people where they're at rather than ask them to convert their expertise. So one of the things that I'm trying to figure out how we can do more, and that I do anecdotally, is just watch what it is that people say all the time. And I think this relates to a kind of broader sensibility or disposition that some of our team members are just wonderful at the walking methodology. They walk around and they chat. And other people are watchers. And it's a question of bringing those different kinds of dispositions to, and I think that is a small point, but it's also something that is missing from traditional consultation mechanisms, the assumption that everybody feels like they belong, they recognise themselves in this setting. So they will walk into the community centre, or they'll log in and fill the questionnaire. And either from disposition or from time or from other forms of resource constraints, not everyone is going to speak in those more formal settings, but they may speak elsewhere. And as researchers, we have to be a bit more open and experimental about what kinds of witness we can bear.
Wonderful. That was so many things to reflect on and engage with in our own research and projects. I think I should. I noticed your cat, Joanna, there. That's perhaps an indicator of time. Perhaps it's like the cat alarm clock. So if I could just extend my thanks and then pass on to Joanna to close us up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you, for that. Was a really fantastic session. I think that's going to be selfishly very useful for me in thinking about some of my own methodologies. But thank you for your expertise and for your time, and especially for our audience for their questions. And I think that's where we're going to leave things today. Thank you.
Thanks so much. They were great questions. Great discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Take care, everybody. Oh, just as one quick reminder before I disappear off, I'll pop in the chat the link for our third and final event, which is on next week with Professor Helen Kennedy from the University of Sheffield on inequalities. It's been a fantastic series so far. Thank you all for coming again. Thank you.
Bye.